Brussels time, so I think it's time to start our webinar. My name is Loukkola. I'm the Director for Institutional Development at the European University Association. And it is my pleasure to be facilitating this webinar today. The webinar where we will be discussing the impact of the institutional evaluation program, which is an evaluation program that offers voluntary, surprise, surprise, institutional evaluations to higher education institutions across the world. And one of the big issues that we know is being discussed in the quality assurance world is, do the evaluations we carry out in general in our higher education institutions or programs, do they have any impact? So what can we learn as institutions or programs from these external evaluations? And today we will discuss this through a couple of case studies that are related to the institutional evaluation program. We have 3 speakers, but before I introduce the speakers, a few practical matters for the participants. We are recording this webinar, and it will be posted on EUA's YouTube channel later afterwards. We encourage you to make comments while our presenters are making their presentations. You can make comments, you can make questions, you can discuss your own experiences about going through evaluations of this type or different kind. And you can see the chat box underneath the PowerPoint presentation, and that's where you can make your comments and write your messages to us. So I hope I get a couple of questions from your side, so I don't need to make all the questions myself. I think that's the most important practical matters. The idea is that we will start with my colleague Anna Gover, who is sitting next to me. First, she will introduce the key points of a study that she and our colleague Goran Dakovic have been working on, looking into the impact of the institutional evaluation program based on the feedback we have received from universities. Then we have 2 different cases. IEP has evaluated a lot of universities, but we've asked 2 quite different universities to talk about their experience. First, we go to the University of Luxembourg, where Ludwig Neyses will be talking to us. What did the University of Luxembourg learn from their experience? Unfortunately, we had a little bit of a technical difficulty suddenly just before we started, and we cannot see Ludwig, but at least when we were testing it, we could hear him very well. So that's already one step forward. And then we move to the Charles University in Czech Republic, where Jiri and Chvatal will be telling us about their experience. I think this will be very interesting to hear 2 different cases from two different countries, and also the universities are very different. One has hundreds of years of tradition, and another one is a very recent university. But let's start with Anna. Tell us what we know as a global picture about the impact of our evaluations.
Yes, thank you, Tia. So actually what I will do is start by speaking just a little bit about IEP in general, so you have a bit of an idea of how the program works. Some of you may be familiar with it already, but it's important to just have the background, as this will then mean that what I talk about afterwards with regards to our study will make a bit more sense. So IEP is an EQAR-registered quality assurance agency. That means that we have been evaluated ourselves by an external review team to ensure that we are acting in accordance with the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance. We've actually been up and running since 1994. So we celebrated our 20th anniversary a couple of years ago, and in fact, yes, 25th is coming up in not too distant future. In those 23 years, we've conducted over 400 evaluations in 49 different countries. I know that next year we'll be adding a new country to the list, so we will finally make it 50 different countries. These are mostly within Europe, but we have done some evaluations outside Europe as well, as you can see from the map on the slide. Actually, if you go to the IEP website, you will see this map in an interactive version, so you can zoom in and out and click on each country to see how many evaluations we've done in the various countries. And the evaluations are carried out by a pool of around 60 experts that come from all over Europe. And these experts are peers in higher education. This means that they are leaders of higher education institutions, rectors and former rectors, other higher education professionals, and of course we have student members on all our teams as well. And I just draw attention to the IEP mission, which is written there on the screen for you. You will be able to see these slides afterwards. We will make them available on the website. As Tia already mentioned, we offer voluntary institutional evaluations. It's important to I think be aware that they are voluntary, so institutions sign up for this. Oh, the slides have got a life of their own. There we go. But it falls outside any kind of national compulsory QA framework. And the aim of the IEP evaluations is to support institutions in developing their strategic leadership and their capacity to manage change. And the way we do this is through an evaluation methodology which is very much improvement oriented and context sensitive. What that means is that we don't take a sort of set of externally defined baseline criteria, or we don't have a kind of checkbox approach, but we really take the institution's mission and goals as the starting point for the evaluation. And we look at what sort of policies and practices the institution has in place and whether these are fit for purpose for meeting those goals and the mission. The evaluations are comprehensive. That means that we cover all areas of institutional activity. We're not looking specifically at any particular faculty or program, but we're covering in general the governance and decision-making processes, teaching and learning, research, service to society, internationalization, and quality culture. As I've already mentioned, we have a pool of experts, and the profile of the experts is that we take very much a peer review approach. So it is based on institutional leaders giving using their own experience to help the evaluated institution in developing further. And it's a European perspective. So all the members of the evaluation team come from different European countries. None will come from the country of the evaluated institution itself. So they bring with them a wide range of different experiences and contexts, which means that they have a lot of different European good practice to draw on. And important to mention is that IEP evaluations don't result in any kind of summative judgment or ranking. So there's no decision process at the end, there's no pass-fail, yes or no. What comes at the end of the evaluation is an evaluation report outlining the key findings and a set of recommendations as to how the evaluation can develop further. At the bottom of the slide on the screen there you see the evaluation process. Those of you familiar with external quality assurance will see that this is pretty standard. There's the preparation phase, there's the self-evaluation report by the institution, there are 2 site visits, and then there's a report by the evaluation team itself and the follow-up. Perhaps a couple of specificities to mention. IEP puts a very strong emphasis on the self-evaluation phase. So we expect that institutions use this as an opportunity to really take a step back and think critically and analytically about their own institution, which I think is something that, you know, in the busy day-to-day lives that we lead in institutions, it's perhaps not so easy to do, is really take that moment to look at the bigger picture. The other important thing to mention is that we do 2 site visits rather than just 1 visit. One of the reasons for this is that because the evaluation team come from countries other than the country in which the institution finds itself, they may need a little bit longer to get familiar with the context in which the institution is working. But it also helps the team and the institution to build up a relationship over 2 visits. They go away, they reflect on what they've thought about, and then they come back afterwards and are able to follow up on the most important issues. So that's the background to IEP as an evaluation process. What I want to move on to now is a study that I've been working on with my colleague in the IEP Secretariat, Goran Dakovic. And we've been trying to look at how institutions that have undergone an IEP evaluation, how they perceive the evaluation to have been useful or not, and what kind of impact has it had on their institution. To do this, we sent a survey to institutions that had been evaluated between the years 2011-12 and 2015-16. And from this survey, we had 32 responses from 8 different countries. It was a fairly nice spread also of responses from initial evaluations and follow-up evaluations. So IEP offers as a starting point an initial evaluation, but then within 1 to 3 years after that, institutions can also sign up for a follow-up evaluation, which looks at what kind of progress has been made in between. I think at this point it's perhaps the good moment to issue a couple of disclaimers. The first one being that when we started out with the idea of this study, we were very much confronted by the fact that impact in quality assurance is something that is incredibly difficult to measure. There's a lot of literature about this, and it's one of the reasons is that it's very difficult to pinpoint to what extent changes that have happened at an institution have happened because of the external quality assurance process, or perhaps they were rather influenced by external factors, or most likely a combination of the evaluation and external factors. But in addition to that, I think one of the difficulties that we have with this study, and the caveat about the data that we have, is that there's probably a certain level of sort of self-selecting bias from the respondents. So in the first sense, of course, IEP is voluntary, so there's a certain level of motivation to want to undergo an IEP evaluation in the first place. But I think that when you're sent a survey asking what have you done in the meantime, those that respond are probably more likely to be those that have done something and that do feel that it has been useful in some way and has had an impact. And finally, to mention that we are working solely on the basis of the responses to the survey, so we haven't then gone back and checked whether what has been reported has actually happened. So those are my disclaimers, and now that's done, then I move on and tell you a little bit about what we discovered. So we asked the institutions, excuse me, to what extent has IEP, to what extent was the evaluation useful, and why? And here the overwhelming majority said that it had been useful or somewhat useful, which obviously is a positive thought for us, that we are being useful to our institutions. But more interestingly then is why do they answer in this way? There was a very wide range of answers, but we grouped them into 3 different categories. So the first category, which was, I think, somewhat less mentioned, but these were related specifically to the procedures and the instruments of the evaluation. The one that was mentioned most frequently was the self-evaluation phase, and as I mentioned before, IEP puts a very heavy emphasis on the importance of this phase. Another thing that was mentioned here was the usefulness of having an external view. Now, this, of course, is not something that's specific to IEP. This comes across with any external quality assurance agency, but having a group of outsiders come to the institution and perhaps not even discover anything new about the institution, but to give an external validation of what had perhaps already been discussed internally, was considered by the responding institutions as being a useful element. The aspects that were most often highlighted were actually those that were characteristics of the IEP process itself, specifically that it gave a European perspective, that it took into account very heavily the context that the institution found itself, and also a lot of respondents mentioned the evaluation team itself, so the quality of the reviewers that were coming to conduct the evaluation. And then again, slightly less mentioned was then the achievements that the institution had after the evaluation as a result of the evaluation. These related mostly to the strengthening of the strategic management, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment when we talk about some of the changes that have came about as a result of evaluations. One other category of answers that was mentioned by a few respondents was the usefulness of IEP for promotional and marketing activities, that after the evaluation they were able to highlight that they'd been through this evaluation process and that this was something that they used in their marketing material and on their website. In terms of the impact of the evaluations, what we asked the respondents that took the survey was we outlined all the different areas that IEP looks at, so governance and decision making, teaching and learning, research, service to society, and quality culture. And for each of these areas we asked, have there been changes because of IEP? So were there changes directly because of IEP, or were there changes because of IEP and other external factors, or were there no changes at all? And then we asked respondents to provide some examples. Certainly the area where the most amount of change was reported was that related to governance and decision making, and examples of changes that took place were given, such as clarifying the roles and the responsibilities of the decision making bodies, support for the strategic planning process, and also quite often student collaboration, so involving students in governance and decision-making processes. There was also, and I think the high impact in this area, of course, links then directly to the focus of IEP as being in its mission to support institutions in their strategic development. The next areas that were most kind of highlighted as where there'd been a positive impact were that of quality culture and internationalization. And we found this quite interesting because these are areas which are not they're not missions in themselves of the institution, but rather they are tools for improving the activities around the central missions. So also here were mentioned some less tangible changes, particularly under the category of quality culture, things like awareness raising or building a community around the sort of improvement orientation of the institution that are the kind of less obvious changes. These were mentioned under this category. When we were looking at the responses, what we found particularly interesting was that there seemed to be a lower level of change reported under the category of learning and teaching. And we thought that as one of the key missions of an institution that we might have expected more change here. But actually, when we looked in a bit more closely into the examples that were given across all the categories, we found that changes related to learning and teaching were perhaps being listed under other categories because they were not so much to do directly with program content, because of course IEP does not evaluate individual programs, but that they were more to do with structural or strategic issues. So things like processes for curriculum development, or strategic decisions around what kind of programs to offer in the first place. Finally, I think it's important to say that the impact in areas of governance and decision-making, research and service to society, these were most often reported as also being linked to external factors. And I think that is entirely understandable, because external factors such as the legal frameworks or stakeholder cooperation would play a much greater role in these areas of activities. So to conclude, well, first of all, we'll say that this is really very much the kind of key headlines. I was given about sort of 8 minutes or so to present, and I know I've gone over that. I've gone over that already. The full study will be published later in the summer on the IEP website, so then you'll be able to read in much more detail. But just to kind of sum up what we took out of this study as IEP, I think in the first place it's a useful validation of some of the anecdotal evidence that we had about the usefulness and impact of evaluations. Of course, we talk to our institutions that undergo evaluations. There's a short survey also that's sent to them immediately after the evaluation. But this tends to be within quite a short time frame after the evaluation, and perhaps too short to really consider any specific impact. But a lot of what we found through this survey backs up what we'd heard in more sort of informal contact with the institution. I think it also confirms the fitness for purpose of the IEP approach, when we say that our mission is to support institutions in their strategic development, and then we see that a lot of the examples of change are indeed related to that area of activity, then that's a nice validation that the approach to the evaluation is really contributing to that. But I think it's also really important to say that that there are many other factors outside IEP that are contributing to these changes, and the institutional motivation is I think a really key one. Because IEP is a voluntary program, there's already a very high level of motivation from the institutions to implement the evaluation right from the start. But it also relies on the institutions doing the internal follow-up work themselves. Again, because IEP is voluntary, nobody is coming back after the evaluation to see what's been done, unless they specifically ask for it. And the recommendations are just that. It is up to the institution itself to decide if and how to address those recommendations. And finally, the external framework, legal changes, for example, I think have a really big role to play, particularly, for example, in relation to the external quality assurance processes. One interesting question that we kind of wanted to finish with was, to what extent is the impact specific to the IEP and the IEP approach, or would it have happened anyway with any other type of external QA process? And I think here I'm going to give a very on-the-fence answer. It depends. I know that's the kind of boring approach, but some aspects I think are specific to IEP, perhaps not unique to IEP, but specific to them. So many of the characteristics that were cited as being most useful, such as the European approach, the context sensitivity, the strategic focus, are really part of the core of the IEP methodology. However, other aspects such as just having an external perspective and involving external stakeholders, these are of course part of any kind of external quality assurance process. What might be interesting moving forward is to look in more detail in terms of looking at some of the follow-up reports that come out of institutions that have asked for a follow-up evaluation, and indeed to review some of the progress reports that we ask for on a basis 1 year after the evaluation. So some ideas for some sort of follow-up research, but we'll stick with this for the moment.
All right. Thank you, Anna, for the introduction to the impact of IEP. We do have the chat box there, so anyone who has any questions is free to use it. In the meantime, while we don't have any questions, I have one. 97% of those who replied to the questionnaire said IEP evaluation had been useful to them. Mm-hmm. That doesn't necessarily yet mean that it had specific impact on them. When you say that the certain areas of activities such as governance and decision making were cited as being the areas where there was most impact, did all these 97% say that IEP had impact in that area? So did all the 97% say that there was impact? No. There was some a very small number that didn't that said that there hadn't been impact in that area. But I think the differentiation between usefulness and impact is an important one, and it's indeed when we started looking at the study we didn't separate out those two issues. But as we were working on the survey to be sent to institutions, it very quickly became clear that we needed to separate these two notions, because they don't necessarily mean the same thing. Yes, because in a way it can be also useful even if you just get a confirmation about some of the things you already knew. Indeed. Which then doesn't necessarily have an impact. Yes, and similarly, some of the examples of usefulness were then less kind of tangible results that they weren't concrete changes, but it helped generate, for example, awareness in the institution about quality assurance, rather than then specifically leading to any kind of structural change or big review of what was happening within the institution. So the question is there any other agency institution prepared to provide quality assurance evaluation? I think there are more and more agencies that are nowadays looking into the impact of their processes. But did you, when you did a literary review, did you find any that would really have made a study on this? Yes, there are some examples. I could cite, for example, QQI, the Irish agency, that have been looking after each round of their evaluations, looking at what kind of impact that this might have had. And I think we're going to see more and more of it. We have, as part of the European standards and guidelines, this requirement that agencies do these thematic analysis, and one area of analysis that might be open is then to look at what kind of impact their evaluations are having. Yes. I think Ludwig has made already comments there, and which are kind of leading to his presentation. I propose that we move to Luxembourg and look at the case of Luxembourg, because Anna, and one thing I do have to say that Anna was mentioning a few times that IEP is a voluntary evaluation, which is correct, but it also is a voluntary. Luxembourg shows that it can be used for a compulsory evaluation, but in that case it was kind of a voluntary to choose IEP to do the evaluation. We'll get to some of the questions later on, but Ludwig, can I
Thank you very
hear
much.
you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So I'm delighted to speak this afternoon.
Yes, so I give the floor to you. And as said in the beginning of the session, unfortunately, we had some practical technical problems and we can't see Ludwig, but we can hear him. So please.
So anybody in the audience, if I speak too quickly or too loudly, then just tell me, please. I'll go through a number of points that I've listed here, and in addition, I will also speak about one of the big questions that anybody has that undergoes an evaluation for the first time, which is the how. People, in my experience, which is long and wide, really are afraid of evaluations. And if done well, and if you're guided well, then it's really not that difficult. Who are we? We are, as Anna already mentioned, a young institution which was founded in 2003. We have 6,300 students and a Bologna ratio. So in other words, PhD students over all the others of about 10%. We have 13 bachelor and 42 master degrees and 1,800 employees and 260 members at professorial level. So by that standard, we are an intermediate sized university. We are not that small as we are by way of in the way of budget, which approaches 250 million euros. We started to have top rankings and used to be the first and are still the first international university in terms of internationality. And then we really wanted to know, is all that really true? Now here is a brushstroke portrait, again with 3 faculties and 3 interdisciplinary centers, but only 2 of those centers were evaluated because the third is much more recent. We divided everything up into 13 research units, so those are the structures that do research, and you can easily work out that a research unit has about 10 to 40 professorial groups, and in the experimental sciences a big group of around a professor has like everywhere else 10 to sometimes 50 people, and in the humanities and social sciences is usually smaller. And then we had 1 unit that was evaluated that was called Central Administration and Management Team. My own biopic you can read here. I've done extensive evaluations, and therefore I was chosen, for the better or the worse, as the then vice president who led the evaluation. Why did we do it? That was one of the questions. Number 1, it is a legal obligation for us in our university law from 2003. We had 2 prior evaluations that were done by ad hoc external committees appointed by the ministry, but not by a QA assured agency or a registered agency. And now we really wanted to know summatively what is the reality around the inner workings. That was for IEP. But we also wanted to know the output in detail, and that, upon my suggestion, was modeled upon the research excellence framework, which unfortunately or fortunately, as you see it, I had the pleasure to do on several occasions in Manchester. But then there was also the formative point that Anna pointed out to help us improve. What were the results? IEP sent 5 experts who were virtually all university leaders, very experienced and extremely good communicators. And they essentially said, well, the overall goals of the University of Luxembourg in the first 13 years of existence, in 12 years of existence, between 2003 and 2015, were reached. The actual evaluation period was 2012 to 15. I'll come back to that. It's useful to its country, and we are an international player, which made us quite proud. They did decide there were deficiencies in our internal processes in decision making, administration, finance, communication, and student empowerment, and a few other points connected to those. And I must say, soon that proved to be true. We had a major crisis just 2 months after the evaluation report came out. The university president had to resign, and actually the evaluation helped us quite a lot to go through that crisis, and I come back to that again. Now, an agency called Interface did the specific output report, and because obviously specific output is discipline specific, we hired a full 45 experts in all these disciplines, and it turned out that 9 of 13 research units were deemed to be internationally leading or competitive. 1 had problems, and we are still working on that, and 3 had a so-so result, mostly positive, but some not so positive. I must also point out that there was a sort of cross-control between the 2 evaluations, IEP and Interface, and we had an excellent coordination between those agencies, and both came actually for the general remarks came to very similar conclusions, which was comforting in a way. Now, the impact, that was Anna's talk, was summative for Interface, for the research evaluation, and formative for IEP. The major impact for us was very clearly what I also wrote in my comment, is in the crisis where then I had to step in as the interim rector. We used the results of both evaluations to argue that the substance of our university was excellent and the problems were just administrative, as both agencies said, i.e. reversible. Obviously, if you are in substance a bad university because you have major structural problems, you've hired bad people and so on, that's largely irreversible, at least over 20 or 30 years, whereas an administrative crisis is easier to overcome. So in terms of the impact, our political impact was the impact of both evaluations in political terms was immense. We also used it for internal and external communication. We told our internal people, well, you've done very well, all of you, in helping us and putting together a great evaluation. And we said that to the government and to the press and so on. And that was a real protection against severe attacks, which we, of course, did get like everywhere else where there is a free press. It also formed the basis for a new 4-year plan. In the middle of this 2017 crisis, we had to come up with a new 4-year plan and adjustment of our focus areas from 6 to 8, and a slight adjustment in terms of the actual focus points. And it formed the basis for our 4-year budget, which we'd also to write in those very, very busy months in the beginning and end of 2017. And lo and behold, we got a 30% increase in our budget over 4 years, and we are quite proud of that because we made it credible that we really had gone through an administrative crisis and not a crisis of substance. And in addition, we had the basis for a medical program. We could argue medicine is important, and the university now is mature to go into medicine, its next adventure for starting in 2020. Now, here is what I pointed out. I added to the questions that IEP asked me The question of how many people in the world of universities want to do and say an evaluation, say, oh, it's quite nice, I'd quite like to do that, but how? And the first advice here is time, take your time, time. Count, if you have them, on about 2 years, including a test run in the first year. Number two, it needs to be led by a unit top manager, probably a vice president or similar, with extensive active and passive evaluation experience. In other words, people who've done evaluations, a number of evaluations abroad and in their own country themselves, not only for grants, but major university political evaluations, and passive, who've undergone major evaluation exercises, like, for example, myself in Manchester and in other places. And in addition, you need an experienced administrator who really knows the inner workings of the university. We had Heike Scheuerflug in Luxembourg, who was instrumental to the success of both evaluations. In addition, you need senior academics at all levels. They need to make clear that that is an outer presentation. It is not a scientific discussion. It is not a grant evaluation. And you need to supplement it by experienced administrative people at all levels again. It takes a lot of time, and you need essentially, you won't be able to do anything else but the evaluation to all intents and purposes. The discussion groups for self-evaluation, because as we just heard, there is a bottom-up process for IEP. The discussion groups should not be more than 5 people, and then their report should go through the faculty council. And here is an absolute key, in my view, an absolute key. I promised from the very beginning, and I nudged our president quite severely not to censure the auto-evaluation. People will be completely demotivated if they get the impression, well, we'll write something, but if as soon as we criticize, the rectorate will take out our most important criticisms. We did make a few suggestions, but only in terms of formulations and so on, but we did accept everything people wrote. And that was a very strong point for the evaluation committee as well, because they really believed that, and we had no problem in terms of people telling behind the evaluation committee, because some of the interviews are anonymous, of course. One of the dangers is that the professor evaluation committee, well, we really couldn't write what we wanted. So do not censure. Of course, you have to keep everybody on board. Not censoring is important, but it's not sufficient. Keep people updated. You need to have regular meetings with the people who contribute majorly to the evaluation. In our instance, it was the research unit leaders. You have to glean ideas from them. They really often say, well, no, I think we should present this in a different way, and it's always been helpful. And you can't afford endless academic discussions about a single sentence or a half sentence. It's the general impression, and that counts, and that is why you need senior people. The self-evaluations and their reports need to be defined in terms of their hierarchical level. We use the faculties because we're relatively small, but in other universities you might need lower levels. And then the first draft report must be proofread by external people in terms of its content, layout, and in terms of its English. I'll come to that. And do that an absolute minimum of 3 months, better 6 months before the actual submission to IEP or another agency, because you really might have to work on the report quite strong intensively. You also, and that's another important point for continental Europeans, beware of cultural and linguistic differences in perception. And that is really a key. If you go to the Anglo-Saxon world, in everything they do, certainly in terms of expressing themselves in evaluations, they will bring out the positive points first. European, and that goes from the west of Portugal to the Ural. People will start complaining first. If you put that in a text to the English native English speaker in terms of the reviewer or people who've grown up in that world, it will sound catastrophic. If you start with a negative statement first, or if you formulate everything you say too negatively, it comes across as a complete disaster to them. So that must be evaluated in the proofreading process. And you need to set tight deadlines. Of course, most people, certainly in the university, and certainly that includes myself, will only start working at the very last minute. So there's no point in saying, well, you've got a year. People will start on the 15th of December to write. So you need to set them a deadline on the 31st of March to make the first draft, and then go ahead and be cool and able to work on them. And our people accepted that once they had seen the rationale behind it. Now, here are my main messages. Evaluation is extremely useful if well done. Our evaluation was very useful in terms of politics and inner and outer communication, and I think that cannot be overestimated. In our case, we were criticized before because of our decision-making process, and that was true. Internal quality assurance, and that was true. The involvement of students, and that was true. And we had to have a stronger focus on teaching and learning. And we've started addressing all that in parallel to getting our 4-year plan and the budget plan and so on right. The leadership of an evaluation process has to be an academic leadership with extensive active and passive experience and authority. And you need external advice. Unless you have very experienced inner people, take external advice from experienced people from somewhere in the world. You need time and time again. And it's for several people in the process, it's going to be a virtually full-time process. Proofreading and rehearsal external are extremely important. And our documents, which we've made available, are on our website here. And of course, you're also welcome to write me an email in the under the address that's at the top of my talk. And thank you very much for listening. And I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion.
Thank you, Ludwig. I have to say that to a large extent, you took the words out of my mouth. As your presentation went on, you kind of answered the questions that I thought I would have. And then in addition, I very much agree with your first main message on the last slide, which is that evaluation is extremely useful if well done. The kind of anecdotal experience we have also shows that the more emphasis and work is being put into the evaluation by the university, the more results and benefits it gets from the evaluation. I have one question to you at this stage. When we started the evaluation in Luxembourg, there was a lot of discussion whether to have this kind of IEP evaluation, which looks at how the university is governed, and then to have the other evaluation that you had at you ended up having at the same time on the research performance, whether to have them one after another or at the same time. For instance, because of the workload that was expected for the university community. The university decided to have the two evaluations in parallel. In retrospective, what would be, do you think it was a good idea to have them at the same time? You know, what's the benefit and what's the downside of that solution?
Yeah, To be totally honest, we didn't have much choice.
Yes.
The government had said since the beginning of 2015, you will have an evaluation, but they only nominated the two agencies by December 2015. So, and in 2016, we needed to do it because of our upcoming 4-year plan. Was it a good idea? Fortuitously, if you will, maybe in hindsight, yes. We avoided some double work. On the other hand, it was, quite honestly, it was a very difficult time. And as I said, a lot of people, at least 5 or 6 people in the senior management, spent the best part of the year only doing that. So if that is clear, I think that it is a good way to do it. It is unusual. The advantage is that you can make clear what one does, IEP, the more general points, the internal workings, the interface or other agency that did the precise research evaluation was the second set, and everybody understood that. So, and the two interacted quite well. So in hindsight, I think we found a new model, but at the price of a lot of pressure.
Okay. Yes. Oh, yeah, and I can indeed imagine that it's been a lot of work to be coordinating two evaluations at the same time. We have a couple of questions in the chat box that I think I will leave as a conclusion of this session. But in the meantime, thank you, Ludwig, for your presentation, and I propose we move to Charles University, and Jiri has been patiently waiting to get his turn to explain what their experience with IEP is. And I think you will probably start by explaining that the profile of the university is quite different from Luxembourg. Please. Now we can't hear you. We need to put your microphone on. Something has happened after our test. Oh, yes.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Now it's back. Okay. Yes.
So good early afternoon to everybody who listens to this seminar. Hopefully you can hear me now. First, I would like to thank our colleagues for this opportunity to present the experiences of our alma mater, because we have a high regard both for the European University Association and the institutional evaluation program. As a human being from the continental Europe, I will start with complaining, as already has been mentioned. If you know something about the institutional evaluation program and its methodology, you will not be surprised that my presentation starts with some of the contextual information. From my point of view, its commitment not to miss a broader picture is one of the most important things on the institutional evaluation program. As some of you might know, the Czech higher education system suffers from many things, public financing being one of them. If you look into the EUA public funding observatory report, you will find out that the Czech Republic belongs at the bottom of the European countries. Consequently, for example, to attract scholars from abroad is very difficult for our universities. In addition, it has to be admitted that this also has something to do with the rather unique system of academic qualifications in the Czech Republic. However, together with a highly prescriptive legislation, this, I would say, squeezes the Czech higher education institution, including our alma mater. As for Charles University, it is a seat of learning that has been in existence for 670 years. As you might guess, it is the oldest and largest university in the Czech Republic, and therefore must meet the highest expectations in terms of quality. However, This is far from a simple task if you consider that it comprises of 17 faculties that are very diverse and enjoy a high degree of autonomy guaranteed by the Higher Education Act. So, one of the major factors leading Charles University to participate in the institutional evaluation program was the adoption of an amendment to the Czech Higher Education Act. This amendment, effective from September 2016, brings fundamental changes to the quality assurance and a system of accreditations. Apart from a degree program accreditation, it is now possible for a higher education institution to obtain an institutional accreditation, which means authorization to independently approve its degree programs. However, only those universities that can guarantee the quality of their activities and continuously strive to improve themselves can obtain this type of accreditation. This means that internal quality culture is a must for Czech universities at the moment. As a consequence, the amendment not only burdens higher education institutions with new responsibilities, but also represents an opportunity to develop their degree programs more independently, and also to a certain extent corrects the existing imbalance of competencies between universities and their faculties. Because in comparison to the previous praxis, it is the university that obtains an institutional accreditation and also has a new body at its disposal, the Board for Internal Evaluation. Therefore, I would say that institutional accreditation is a watershed moment for the university, an opportunity to halt and think through its concept of quality orientation. However, as you might suspect, this is not a straightforward story, since Charles University as a traditional university is not a top-down institution and makes significant efforts to preserve academic space and autonomy for its faculties. So a high degree of fragmentation is one of the issues it has to tackle. To illustrate my point, I would just like to mention that at the moment we have over 300 degree programs with more than 600 specializations at Charles University. Many of them are taught separately on 2, 3, or 4 faculties, despite the fact that there are some, I would say, elective affinities between them. So I think that the major part of our motivation to choose the institutional evaluation program could be quite clear from what has already been said. I would just like to add that the timing of the evaluation also corresponded with rector elections, and so the candidates had many suggestions from its outputs on how to head the university. In addition, since Charles University is a traditional and some even say conservative institution, it moves rather slowly. So the evaluation has not been ended yet. We will undergo a follow-up evaluation in 2019 with the aim to reflect on what has been done and to gain suggestion of what should be our key priorities for next 5 years expressed in the strategic plan. Finally, yet importantly, there are many reasons inherent in the program itself. I would just like to highlight one of them, and that is that it offers an independent view. If you recall what kind of institution you are dealing with, you will probably understand how different it is when an external authority with a friendly intent loudly names the pressing issues. The legitimacy to promote structural changes is in this case much stronger. Another reason why we chose the institutional evaluation program is the fact that it mirrors the Czech institutional accreditation to a large extent. Both of them require a self-evaluation report, on-site visits, and active participation of the academic community. Of course, there are differences. On the one hand, you have a self-evaluation report that has 30 pages. On the other hand, you have a self-evaluation report with almost 200 pages, 2 site visits versus more than 20 site visits, and dozens versus hundreds of academics participating in both evaluations. It took us a year to prepare the application for institutional accreditation and 6 months of its assessments by the National Accreditation Bureau for Higher Education. But we have obtained the institutional accreditation for 10 years. This is, I would say, one of the tangible results of the whole evaluation. In fact, we should receive the official confirmation of this fact today, as a matter of coincidence. Among other things, the international evaluation indeed was one of the proofs explicitly mentioned by the Accreditation Bureau that we have a viable internal quality assurance system. Of course, it does not end here for us. There are many things that we need to address. In total, we have received 23 recommendations on how to push forward our alma mater. Some of you can see in front of you. From my point of view, one of the most important but also hardest things is that before we move forward, we should carefully think through cornerstones of equality orientations. For example, to answer the question, what is the study program of Charles University and what do we expect from this program? Since the institutional accreditation has swallowed up much of our time and energy, many other recommendations has been elaborated, but much remains to be done. Therefore, I will briefly mention just the most important steps. In parallel with the preparations for an institutional accreditation, each of our faculties was obliged to rethink its degree programs and provide the university with a proposal for their structure, including the integration and modularization, and justify this structure. This has been done, and many of those new degree programs will be accredited during next few months. Interconnected with this step is the establishment of 10 doctoral platforms that bring under their roof academics responsible for individual degree programs in order to enhance consistency and quality of the learning experience for doctoral students, which is also one of the recommendations that we have received from the evaluation team. As for the research and its quality, the institutional evaluation program has provided the university with another, I would say, political argument why it should take the reins and establish its own internal wallet system for research evaluation and use it to redefine its research politics. At the moment, well, its principles and components are agreed upon, and preparations such as looking for foreign scholars who are willing to participate in the peer review are underway. And that would be all from my side.
Thank you. Very interesting. We have the experience that other universities have occasionally also invited us to do an evaluation ahead of their institutional accreditation, so to do a kind of a mock-up and to prepare ground in a way for the actual accreditation. Have you gotten any feedback from your community? Was this useful to kind of have one type of evaluation before the accreditation committee did their work? You know, did it help them in kind of to be more prepared?
I would say yes, because they were prepared that there will be some on-site visits, because Czech institutional accreditation has some specifics. There are, I guess, 47 fields of study that are accredited separately, such as sociology, biology, and so on. So there were many on-site visits related to each of these fields of study. So working on the institutional evaluation program was kind of preparatory work for the institutional accreditation, also for them to get used that there are some committees that they will scrutinize their activities.
Yes, because I remember having had the same discussion a little bit in Luxembourg as well, where our evaluation was the first time when it was really at the institutional level, that it wasn't the programs or faculties that were being evaluated, but the colleagues were asked to comment on the university as a whole, that it's a new experience. Yes.
It is one of the problems that we have. It is the high degree of fragmentation. So for example, we have 5 medical faculties, 3 faculties of theology, and so on and so on.
Yes. Maybe we can have Ludwig's voice in as well. Thank you, Ludwig, for the comment about the link between the 2 universities, which I had not thought of. Yes, but for Luxembourg, this was also the first time I understood where you had this kind of institutional evaluation.
Yes, we had
university level
evaluations with some of the same committee members, but those were ad hoc committees, and you, in other words, IEP, was the first agency that was EQAR registered.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you to both of you. I thought very interesting presentations. I'm acutely aware that we've gone over time. I've been very flexible today with especially with my colleague Anna, who went over time in her presentation. But I do want to ask us to kind of wrap up the conversation with in replying to the questions we've got from Kirsi and Elise in the audience. Maybe Anna, would you like to take them?
Yes, I can. In terms of the difference between the summative and the formative approaches, particularly with regards to quality assurance, I think what you have here is the kind of 2 sides of the quality assurance coin, so that of accountability and that of enhancement, and some evaluation methodologies are geared more towards one than the other. But I think here is also, it can be quite dependent on a country's legal framework in terms of what kind of evaluations are offered by the agency as to whether it is necessary to have some form of yes or no, pass or fail accreditation at the end of the evaluation, or whether simply the process of going through the evaluation is sufficient. And this links very nicely to the other question that I can answer in terms of the result of an IEP evaluation. What we do at the end of the evaluation is, in addition to the report and the recommendations, institutions they receive the evaluated by IEP icon, which is essentially a logo that they can then use in their promotional material on their website, etc. And they can use this for a period of 5 years after the end of the evaluation. So that's the kind of we don't like to call it a label, but that's the sort of tangible sticker, as it were, that comes at the end of the evaluation.
Okay, thank you. I would like to thank all the speakers for their contributions, and just to say that we do have at the moment the registration period open for the evaluations for the next year and further information is available online on our website. And I think Anna also referred to a couple of other things that are available on the website. So here on the screen you can at the moment see what the website really looks like. It's www.iepqaa.org. Thank you, Jiri and Ludwig. We are going to finish here right now, but EUA has more webinars coming up, and one will be in almost exactly in 1 month in the end of May. We are getting ready to publish our Trends 2018 survey results, and the colleagues will be talking about what the learning and teaching at European universities looks like on the 13th of May. So anyone who is interested in that, keep an eye on the EUA website. I think there are, and I've seen some of glimpses of the results, and there are interesting results as to what is going on in Europe in learning and teaching. Thank you everyone, for participants, and those who posed questions, but participants for listening to us, and indeed to Ludwig and Jiri. And I wish your institutions all the luck in taking things forward. I don't think Charles University is the only one where things do not happen always so quickly. Usually implementing new things takes time.
Yes.
But thank you. And great afternoon to everyone. And thank you to Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.